All right, there you go. People are always asking for videos and pictures and proof. They don't want to go get their own proof, but they want me to show it. So there's a little video for you that somebody sent me, and I think it's pretty spooky, pretty compelling. Let's jump into this video. I've got 3 really awesome stories, 3 exciting stories that it's rare to get 3 really exciting stories back to back, but I got them. I think you guys are going to enjoy this, so hang on to your weaves. We're finna roll. All right, here we go. All right, here's an email from Kathy. This is fantastic. I love reading this story, and I hope you guys like it as much as I did. Kathy writes, my father was the second youngest of 10 kids. He and his twin sister were born in 1945 at their family home in Clay, West Virginia. He grew up being called Buckshot, and until I was 9 or 10 years old, I thought that was his Christian name. Although he passed away in 2017, he told a story many times before he died. My brother was with him when it happened, and he has never discredited a word of my dad's story, so I have no doubt that this story is true. In 1978, when my brother Phil was 11, Dad said, "Come on, boy, it's time. You're going to go on your first raccoon hunt." Our father's love for raccoon hunting was infectious, so Phil was tickled to death to be joining him for the first time. They put on their coal miner's light helmets and strapped the battery packs to their waists, and they headed out. The only one more excited for the hunt that night than my brother was my dad's favorite dog. He was a walker named Pretty Boy. Whenever he saw Dad getting ready, he always started panting and barking and dancing around his legs. He knew they were going hunting, and he couldn't wait to see the tailgate drop on my dad's 1976 Chevy Love truck so he could load up. That night, my dad and brother drove 20 miles to his friend Rick's place. Rick had several dogs of his own, along with 2 teenage sons who also hunted. They decided where they'd be going, and they set out as it was getting dark. They knew they'd have good luck that night because the farmer who lived there had been complaining about the raccoons getting into his feed bins. With their good quality hunting dogs and their own skills, they were sure to be able to relieve the farmer of at least a few of those pests. Dad, Rick, and the boys walked the dogs out on leashes, located a scent trail, and turned them loose. After that, it was only a matter of time before the dogs treed. Until then, all they had to do was settle in near their trucks and wait and listen. It didn't take long. Within 15 minutes, the dogs had treed. My dad said they were real close. They turned on their lights and started up the mountains towards the sound of the dogs. They had to cross a barbed wire fence, but they found the dogs at the base of a large beech tree. In West Virginia, these trees, with their pale, almost white bark, can grow to massive proportions. It can take 3 men with their arms stretched wide to reach around the circumference of one. Because of the tree's size and the fact that it still had branches of dead leaves here and there, they thought they might have difficulty seeing the raccoon. But once the dogs were leashed and pulled away from the tree, however, they discovered they'd have no trouble spotting what the hounds had treed. But it wasn't a raccoon. Sitting up on the branches of the tree, covered in reddish-brown hair, was a young Sasquatch. It was 6 feet tall, and Dad described it as looking like a tall, skinny orangutan with a face like a man. It looked down on them with glowing red eyes and bared its big square teeth and sharp canines at them. That's when it screamed, and it hit them in the chest like a Mack truck. Phil and the other 2 boys fell to the ground and began to cry. Rick stood frozen in place, and he was unable to move. The dogs cowered in submission, but Pretty Boy managed to crawl over to where Phil was, and he laid across him. A second later, an answering scream came from somewhere in the distance, followed by another one that sounded like it was a mile or so away. That was what shook my dad back to reality. He pushed Pretty Boy off of Phil and helped him to his feet before punching Rick in the arm and saying, "Let's get the heck out of here." Yeah, let's, Rick answered as he helped the boys up off the ground. Let's go. Their dogs led them down the mountain as they all hightailed it back to the woods. They were only about halfway there when they heard something behind them come crashing through the woods. It sounded like a bulldozer following them. At that point, Dad picked up Phil like a football and broke into a dead run. He cleared the 3-strand barbed wire fence and didn't stop until he reached the truck. The dogs were there waiting for them. Whatever had chased them down the mountain never caught up with them, but stayed just close enough to keep them motivated. From the top of the mountain came another screaming sound. Daddy thought it had to be a second one, but they weren't going to hang around to find out. He loaded my brother and his dog into the front of his truck while Rick loaded the boys and dogs into theirs, and they all sped off. Dad headed straight for home and didn't stop until he got there. For him and my brother, it was the end of a harrowing experience. For Rick and his family, however, it was just the beginning. Dad and Phil had a 20-mile drive to make, and Rick and his boys lived a short 7 miles away. As soon as he got home, he told his wife all about what happened that night. They'd been home about 30 minutes, and Rick was still trying to gain control of his heart rate when the same screams they'd heard up on the mountain started coming from the woods behind their barn, about 100 yards from the house. Rick's wife was furious. "You brought those things here. I've got babies in this house, and you brought those things here?" And she yelled at him, "Get rid of them now!" Rick sent her and the kids upstairs with the warning not to come down no matter what she might hear. He then walked around their farmhouse and secured all the doors and windows. As the screams got closer, rocks the size of baseballs began landing on the tin roof. Soon something was walking around the house with heavy stomps that shook their antique hutch and rattled the china plates that were a gift from his wife's granny. He'd brought the dogs inside with him when they got home, but they were hiding under the bed and were of no use. Every 10 minutes or so, something slapped the side of the house or tapped on the window. Rick's nerves had just about reached their limit when he heard his wife screaming from upstairs. He ran up to find her pointing at the window in near hysterics. "I saw a face in that window," she claimed, but that was impossible. That window was 12 feet off the ground. "Call the law," she pleaded. "Do you think they're going to believe me when I tell them we have a 12-foot peeping Tom outside our window?" Rick reasoned with her. "They'll lock us up." After his wife screamed, there were no more sounds from outside. They were all able to get the kids settled down and into bed, but Rick and his wife stayed up the rest of the night. Once the sun came up, he went outside and walked around the house. Then he went back inside and he called buckshot. My dad got there as quickly as he could. He had his Winchester .270, his .357 pistol, and Rick grabbed his 12-gauge Remington, and together they went around the house, the barn, and the perimeter fence. They found rocks on the low side of the roof and footprints all around the house. The largest of the tracks measured 24 inches long and 10 inches across with 5 toes. Where those prints stood under the upstairs window, they sank 3 inches into the ground. "That must have been our peeping Tom, you reckon?" said Rick. Another set of prints measured 16 inches long and 8 inches across, but they only had 4 toes. The third set was smaller, still at 12 inches, and they only had 4 toes too. Rick and Dad estimated the smallest set must have been the one their dogs had treed, while the middle-sized set must have been the mother, and the largest set belonged to the daddy, or the alpha male. Within the week, Rick and his wife moved to North Carolina, where her family lived, but he and my dad remained friends over the years. And by the way, the place they were hunting that night, it's called Booger Holler. Oh man, that is terrifying. How could those things follow him all the way back 7 miles from where they treed that Sasquatch? That is crazy. Man, what a memory. What a memory. What a story. What a story. Kathy, thank you so much for sending that to us. I love the way you write these, and it's just perfect. Just a perfect story for this channel, and I hope the audience enjoyed it. I know they did. All right, let's move to another one. Little break here. I announced a couple of weeks ago that I had a new audiobook out for sale. It is a story written by Jack LaFountain. It's called Death Rides the Red River. It's a Western, and it's a werewolf story. It's really good. If you guys are interested in a good audiobook, I'm going to put the link in the description, but you can find it on Amazon or Audible. Just do a search for Death Rides the Red River, and it'll pop up, but there'll be a link in the description. If you'd like a promo code to get this audiobook free, just email me. I announced that the other day, and I said I would give 5 out. 8 people emailed me wanting free copies, and I gave every one of them a promo code, but only 4 of those have been redeemed. So I've still got plenty left. If you guys would like a free download of Death Rides the Red River, you have to have an Audible account or an iTunes account. So just send me an email at dixiecryptid@gmail.com, and I'll send you a promo code. So I just thought I'd let you know that and I've got 6 audiobooks out. You guys can go to my website. I've got them all there. You can just go to the audiobooks tab. It's at dixiecryptid.com, dixiecryptid.com. Go to the audiobooks tab and you'll see all the audiobooks. And I'm working on 6 more at the moment. So I'm really enjoying doing this. Okay, let's jump to the next story. All right, I don't know what this man's name is. It could be a woman. I think it's a man. There's no way to know his name, and that doesn't really matter, but here's his story. Back in the 1940s and 1950s, my mother's family lived on a small farm in North Alabama. My grandfather worked in the coal mines, but he owned the farm, so they didn't have to live in the camp. A small spring-fed creek that ran along the north edge of the property provided water for the family, the animals, and for washing. Sometime around the summer of 1950, there was a drought, which in North Alabama means it didn't rain for 2 weeks, and that creek almost dried up. They had to install a hand pump on the spring to get enough water to keep the farm going. Everybody and everything was hot, grumpy, and thirsty that summer. It was an area where electric lights were still considered a modern convenience, and air conditioning was unheard of. With no breeze, the world baked under a hot, still glaze of sweat and dust. To alleviate some of their misery, they'd eat dinner early and then go out and sit on the front porch to give the house time to cool off before bed. They'd drag a big oscillating floor fan up to the screen door and sit and talk while doing the sort of light chores that could be accomplished while sitting in a rocking chair. Socks and clothes were mended and peas were shelled until the sun went down, and then it was time for bed. That's when the screaming started. Somewhere in the woods across the creek, something was screaming like a woman who was being strangled. Those were interspersed with long, mournful howls loud enough to hurt your eardrums. In the gloom of the dusk, they could vaguely see the trees shaking in the distance and hear something stomping on what sounded like 2 feet through the thick growth around the spring, but they never saw an animal. As soon as the racket would start, the farm animals would stampede to the other end of the pasture, as far from the spring as they could get. They wanted nothing to do with whatever was over there making that noise. Our neighbor owns 6 big hounds trained to hunt raccoons. Raccoon hounds can be mean, and these dogs were vicious animals that weren't afraid of anything. They tore off across the creek to hunt down and kill whatever was making the noise and shaking the trees. 6 dogs went, but only 4 came back. Of those 4, one had its back ripped open so badly they had to put it out of its misery. That was when the men knew that they had to act. My grandfather, my 2 oldest uncles, the neighbor, and his sons loaded their shotguns and rifles and went to see what this thing was. They found the 2 dead dogs, ripped into pieces and thrown up into the trees, but they didn't find what killed them. The next night, the screaming returned with a vengeance. The dogs were put on chains and the children were kept inside. It screamed until after midnight, while everyone stayed in their homes and hoped that whatever it was would eventually go back to where it came from. The men didn't want to see if it was going to return the following night. They were already in the woods with their guns loaded for boar and waiting for it. That night, they stalked that thing and hunted it down, and they killed it and buried it somewhere in the woods. Everyone in that hunting party is dead now. When I was a child, I asked, but none of them ever told me what they killed that night. It is conceivable that it was a panther. Panthers, or so I've read, can sound like a woman screaming. And since panthers are a protected species, shooting one would have been illegal. They would have had a good reason to shoot it, shovel and shut up about it. But do panthers shake trees? When they walk, do they sound like someone stomping around on two legs? Do they throw bodies of dogs into the trees? I honestly have no idea what those men killed that night. And now that they're all gone, we'll probably never know. That is so creepy. That is the creepiest story. And the way this writer phrased that last paragraph just put this haunting air about the whole story. I loved it. I love this story. Thanks to the writer for sending it. I really appreciate it. Let's go to the last story. Okay, this last story is, the man says you can call me B. This may not be a Bigfoot story, but let's read on and see. Back in 1982, I had an experience in Bullitt County, Kentucky that has kept me out of the woods until this day. I had just gotten my driver's license, so I borrowed my dad's 77 custom van to go on a double date. I swung by and picked up my friend Chuck and the two girls, and we headed out into the country to go parking. Back then, the thing to do was go parking, indulge a little underage drinking, and explore the mysteries of the opposite sex. So that was our plan. We drove down to the Salt River bottoms along a one-lane gravel road. It was a pretty desolate spot with the occasional house or farm every few miles. But there were a few spots where we could pull off the road and be alone with our dates. The sun had already set, and we were looking for one of those spots to pull over, so we were already traveling slow when Chuck suddenly asked, "What was that?" 100 feet in front of us, something large and black was lying on the road. I slowed the van to a crawl. As we got closer, I started thinking it looked like a cow laying there with its back to us. Once we got to within 10 feet of it, I decided to get a better look, so I put the van in park and opened the door to get out. As I did so, it made a loud metal clanking sound those van doors are famous for. That thing on the road popped its head up and looked right at us. This thing was covered in black hair. It had the head of a dog with a large snout and ears that stood upright. It felt like all the blood rushed out of my body and my hair stood on end as I sat there looking at it. Chuck kept asking, "What is that thing?" But I couldn't register a logical explanation or give him a reasonable answer. This thing was huge. It must have weighed 700 pounds or more. Dogs don't get that big. It locked eyes on us for maybe 10 seconds, and all we could do was stare back at it. Then the impossible happened. This monster of an animal stood up on 2 feet. It took a step towards us and put what looked like a hand on the hood of the van with enough pressure to rock it backward. My God, it had to be at least 9 feet tall. It had to bend down to look at us through the windshield, and it glared down at us like a predator savoring its next meal right before it strikes. And that's when we saw its teeth. It had a mouth full of sharp canines like a wolf or a werewolf. The girls were in the back screaming and crying, and I was frozen in place. And Chuck finally shouted, "Get us out of here!" And that brought me back to reality. I grabbed the shifter and dropped it into gear and I pushed the accelerator to the floorboard. We spun out, leaving a rooster tail of gravel and dust in our wake. The monster, that's how I think of it, rolled off to the passenger side. It was a good thing he went that way. The driver's door was still open. At least it could have torn the door off. At worst, well, I don't want to think about the worst. I didn't slow down until we were back on the pavement. The girls were inconsolable, so we took them home. There's nothing like a werewolf to put a damper on teenage hormones. And Chuck and I... Oh man, that thing ruined your date. Chuck and I downed a few beers before I dropped him off just to calm our nerves. Of course you did. We must have been in shock or something. I don't remember either one of us speaking a word about what had just happened. Once I dropped him off, I drove home and I went straight to bed. The next morning, I was abruptly awakened by my dad, who made me go out to the driveway and look at the van. I expected to be yelled at for driving gravel roads and covering his black van with dust, but that wasn't what he wanted me to see. Pointing at the hood, he demanded, "What the hell did you do to the van last night, boy?" I walked over to where he was standing and I saw 5 large, deep claw marks running across the hood. Well, what could I say? Sorry about that, Dad. Must have been that giant werewolf that did it. He would have thought I was nuts, so I just said, I don't know, and I had to pay for a new paint job anyway. A few days later, Chuck finally asked me what the hell we saw that night. I still didn't have an answer. The girls were pretty much done with us. Bringing a werewolf to a date has a way of doing that. This was all back in 1982, so we didn't have the internet to look these things up. Heck, we didn't even have cable until the following year. Until this day, the only thing that I have seen that even closely resembles what we saw that night is the werewolf in the movie Van Helsing. Watching that movie made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. From what I've seen on the internet, I'm guessing it was a dog man that we saw. And here's something more. I have an uncle and 3 cousins who were all police officers. A few months after this happened, I was playing nickel and dime poker with the family when I overheard my cousin, a Jefferson County canine officer, saying that a woman's body was found up in a tree and torn to shreds at Tom Wallace Park. I took him outside and told him the story of what happened to my friends and me just a few months earlier. Although he did listen intently at the time, albeit with a look of bewilderment on his face, we never spoke of it again. Years later, he was shot and killed in the line of duty. I don't know exactly what I saw out there on that gravel road that night, but I do know that it was bad, nasty, evil, and deadly. God only knows what would have happened if we'd already been parked there and it crept up on us. I'm not afraid of the woods, but I'm terrified of what I know is out there lurking around in them. Just look at all the people who go missing, never to be seen or heard from again. And, Mr. B, you got that right, man. You got that right. I don't know what to think of these dogman stories. I absolutely believe this story. They saw something that could be the classic dogman. I thought maybe this was a mistaken Bigfoot encounter, but it's a dogman story. Man, 3 awesome stories in a row. You guys are doing a great job. I really appreciate you sending me these. And thank you to this writer for sending it. It's a great story. We all enjoyed it. Thank you, sir. Thank you all so much for hanging with me to the end. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you. And we will see you guys on the next video. Thank you.